They say a nation is really just the story it tells about itself. And if that's true, then its literature? That's the script. Today, we're going to trace how America's identity has evolved, from basically a colonial echo into a global voice, all by looking at the books and poems that shaped it. And this whole journey really starts with one big question.
How does a nation find its voice? It's a fundamental question, right? One that every person and every country has to figure out. For America, this wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a centuries-long journey of discovery, of arguments, and of constant reinvention.
And we have to be clear, that journey did not begin in an empty land. Long before any colonists showed up, North America was humming with hundreds of different cultures. And instead of written books, they had something just as powerful. These incredibly rich and vibrant oral traditions. We're talking myths, legends, songs, all passed down from one generation to the next. The story of this place started way, way before the English language ever arrived.
So the first phase of written American literature was basically an import. The early colonists brought their language, their culture, and their God with them, and their writing was all about that mission. It wasn't about creating something brand new, but about trying to make sense of their purpose in this so-called New World. The Puritans, especially, had a huge influence. They came over to New England looking for religious freedom, and their very specific worldview shaped pretty much everything, especially their writing. For them, the wild, untamed American wilderness wasn't just a place to build a house, it was a spiritual battleground. So writing wasn't for entertainment, not at all. It was a tool for survival, spiritual survival. It was how they explored God's will and documented this constant, daily struggle between being saved and being damned. Every single word was heavy, weighed against the fate of your eternal soul. And because of that, the literature from this time is packed with sermons, religious histories, and these really intense personal journals and poems. Writers like Anne Bradstreet and Edward Taylor weren't trying to become famous authors. They were just trying to understand their place in God's master plan. But then a massive shift started to happen. New ideas started to drift over from Europe, and the whole purpose of writing changed, like completely. It went from explaining God's world to actually trying to build a new human one. The voice of the preacher started to fade, and the voice of the revolutionary took its place. This was the American Enlightenment, and suddenly concepts like logic, reason, and individual rights were the hot new thing. People started to believe that they could shape their own futures, their own governments, instead of just taking orders from a king an entire ocean away. And writers were right at the heart of this huge transformation. You had Benjamin Franklin using his wit to create a new American ideal. And then there's Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet, Common Sense, used plain, powerful language to make the case that independence wasn't just a good idea, it was absolutely necessary. This is where the pen really did become mightier than the sword. Okay, so you've won a revolution. Great. The next challenge? It was even bigger, creating a culture. For decades, American literature was just kind of an offshoot of English literature. But in the 19th century, writers started to ask a really important question. What does it mean to sound American? And a very American answer came from a movement called Transcendentalism. Its core idea was a pretty radical shift. The individual, not the institution, was the true spiritual center of the universe. It was a whole philosophy built on self-reliance, trusting your intuition, and having a deep personal connection to nature. And what's so fascinating is that this philosophical expansion was happening at the exact same time as the nation's physical expansion. As the borders of the country literally pushed westward, the horizons of the American mind were pushing outward too. The massive scale of the continent just demanded a bigger, bolder kind of literature to capture it all. This era gave us an absolute explosion of iconic voices. You've got Emerson and Thoreau defining self-reliance. You've got Walt Whitman trying to wrap his arms around the entire sprawling, democratic country in his poetry. But it wasn't all sunshine and philosophical walks in the woods. You also had writers like Poe and Hawthorne who were diving into the darker, more psychological corners of the American soul, reminding everyone that the past, especially that old Puritan past, still had plenty of ghosts. All that optimism and romantic individualism, though, was about to run headfirst into a brutal reality. The country's great unresolved sin, slavery, finally erupted into a war that would tear the nation apart and forever change the stories it told about itself. The Civil War was a national trauma on a scale it's just hard to imagine. Those romantic ideals of honor and glory that were so popular before, they just died on the battlefields of Shiloh and Antietam. I mean, how can you write about a noble individual hero when you're faced with death on an industrial scale? Literature couldn't afford to be idealistic anymore. It had to get real.
This huge shift gave birth to a brand new literary movement, realism. Realism wasn't interested in how the world should be. It was all about showing the world as it was, with all its complexities, its injustices, and its harsh realities. The focus moved away from the inner world of one person and onto the social forces that were shaping everybody's lives.
This new approach led to a totally different kind of author. You had writers like Mark Twain who captured how real Americans actually talked. Stephen Crane wrote about war not as a grand adventure, but as a confusing, terrifying psychological mess. And then an offshoot called Naturalism took it even further, with authors like Jack London writing about humanity as this tiny creature at the mercy of huge forces, nature, genetics, fate, that were way beyond our control. The American voice was getting tougher, more skeptical, and a lot more honest.
As America rolled into the 20th century, the pace of change just became dizzying. We're talking 2 world wars, the Great Depression, rapid industrialization. The old ways of telling stories just didn't seem to fit a world that felt like it was breaking apart at the seams.
The nation became a global power, but that came with a whole new set of anxieties and disillusionments. All that confidence of the 19th century was pretty much replaced by a feeling of uncertainty and loss. How could you possibly write a traditional, orderly novel when the world itself felt so chaotic and fragmented?
So the literary evolution just hit light speed. It went from realism, trying to depict the world as it is, to naturalism, seeing the universe as this kind of blind, uncaring machine. And that led right to modernism. This was a radical break from the past. Writers started experimenting with the very form of the novel, of the poem, to try and reflect this new, disjointed, modern way of thinking.
And this gave us the famous Lost Generation. T.S. Eliot wrote poetry that perfectly captured the feeling of a broken culture. F. Scott Fitzgerald showed us the glittering, beautiful, and totally empty promise of the American dream. Ernest Hemingway came along and stripped language down to its bare essentials, and John Steinbeck gave a powerful, unforgettable voice to the victims of the Great Depression. The single American voice had splintered into many voices, and each one was telling a different, urgent piece of the story.
Which brings us right back around to the beginning. The journey to find an American voice never really ended. It's still fragmenting, still merging, still arguing with itself, and it's constantly being redefined by new generations. So that leaves us with a final, really crucial question. What story is America telling itself right now?